I'm sitting next to the real expert of economic thought.
No, what you said, Jeff, about John Locke. I'm sure I have a quote from Condorcet in 1794, where he exactly wrote against John Locke. But since John Locke was English and Condorcet was French, so you understand the implication. Listen to what he wrote in his Esquisse. I quote, "It is easy to demonstrate that fortunes tend naturally to equality and that their excessive disproportion would either not exist or would have quickly ceased if civil laws had not set up artificial means to perpetuate it." That is 1790. He understood everything. In other words, inequality is not a state of nature. That is the point. Civil laws are what today we would call institutions, one type, legal or economic institution, etc. But as I said, Locke, and Jeff was right too. The second remark, the invisible hand in Adam Smith is a providential view. It's correct. Why? Because that idea Adam Smith took from Giambattista Vico, an Italian scholar from Naples, who 50 years before, he wrote exactly about the invisible hand. So Adam Smith took that because he spent some time in Paris as a scholar, and in Paris, the idea of Giambattista Vico were already known. But there is an addendum, because from this point of view, Adam Smith was very, let's say, smart, because he said the invisible hand will obtain an optimal, as we say in economics, optimal allocation under three conditions. All the market should be perfect competitive. Second, no public goods should exist. And the third is no externalities. Now, since in reality, the three conditions, at least 2 out of 3, cannot exist, I do not say do not exist, but cannot exist, the result is that the invisible hand cannot operate. In other words, in a virtual world where the three conditions are met, the invisible hand obtains the expected results. But since these conditions are never met because they cannot be met, the result. So that is a benign interpretation of Smith. Some people say Adam Smith implicitly and indirectly opened his view to the intervention of government, just because in reality we need public goods. And with public goods, the market mechanism stops working. We know that perfect competition does not exist. Today, there is a concentration of power, which it is obvious that it is impossible, etc. So perhaps it is a benign, but who knows? He couldn't express himself. The only thing to conclude is when 1 year before he died, Bentham went to pay a visit to him, bringing to Adam Smith the first copy of his famous book about utilitarianism. Smith threw him away and said, "Go away," because he was anti-utilitarian. But as I said, utilitarianism, England is England in those days, and became the new gospel for economists. And that is still 90% true nowadays.
The floor is open. We've had so many things put on the table. Rocco.
Thank you. Let me say a few words in defense of Giovanni Battista Vico, because when Giovanni Battista Vico speaks of providence, he implies that providence has its action through the virtuous behavior of man. And virtuous behavior of man includes the idea that the others are encompassed within the personality of the individual, and therefore there is an interest of the community that cannot be aside. So it seems that Adam Smith takes one excerpt, one point, severing it from the globality of the thought of Vico. I think that Vico, you find the thought of Vico much better in another author that is very dear to Professor Zamani, and with the Abbe Galliani. Galliani has the idea that there is a civil economy, that is, that the economy is not just based on the individual greed. The economy is based on the just preoccupation of the individual to make a living for himself and on the common good of the community. And these are the two pillars that must stand in a certain balance to one another. Vico is not that bad. First. Second observation, if I can, another one. As one who has studied the history of political thought, don't imagine that philosophers are so coherent as sometimes they want to be considered. They want to be coherent, but if you read in depth, you find much more in each one of them. I give you one example. Take Hayek. You have a first Hayek, an Austrian Hayek, and an American Hayek. The American Hayek corresponds exactly to what you have said. But there is an Austrian Hayek, an Hayek who is a disciple of Karl Menger. And Karl Menger has theoretized an idea that you find now in Pope Francis. That is, the market is based on desires. But there are desires and there are fundamental needs. And in order to have a well-ordered market, you must cover the fundamental needs before you open the market. So you must give a fundamental income to everybody that covers the basic needs in order to make all them able to enter into the market. And if you have a market in which there is no basic income, then you have not really a market. You have a market that is constricted, like Professor Zamani says, or like Rerum Novarum says. It is a market in which the worker really is a slave because he has no alternative. You have the form of the contract, but the contract is a contract in which one can give or not as a decision to make. And the worker can only take what is given to him, because otherwise he must starve. So the world is complicated. And we can find allies or
can I say one thing, please?
Partners for a dialogue, also within traditions that at the first sight seem to be foreign.
Please, we need to have some kind of justice in the discussion. So the people have only 3 minutes to put the question. In the contrary, we can have new conference. So please.
I just wanted to agree with Rocco, 30 seconds, that Hayek in 1945 is rather reasonable about social provision, but when he comes to America, he goes far to the right because he's championed as the libertarian. And so by 1962, he says no social programs.
Of course, of course. Also for the
Helen.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just wanted to come back to this question about duties and rights, and about the connection between the human rights and the Sustainable Development Goals, which I think is a very, very interesting idea that in our age, we are expressing something similar to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in a language that's more close to the main language. I mean, to me, that shows we've moved from a society that's more governed by law to a society that's more governed by economic thinking. I mean, it's economists that have goals, businessmen have goals, you know, we need strategies to get there, all that kind of stuff. So, but I think it's a very, very interesting idea, and we need to obviously work with where we are, you know, deal with the world the way it is, not necessarily, we have to try to change it, of course, as well, but meet people where they are. First thing I want to say about the duties thing is, and you probably know about that, but it's interesting to me that they did want to have duties as well as rights, but they couldn't get an agreement on them. And I think that's quite interesting to look at why they couldn't get the agreement. The African Declaration, as you know, does have duties in as well. So some of the subsequent ones, anyway, I'm not telling you anything you don't know already, but I think it's just interesting to put that on the table. I think also to connect the thing about moving from rights to goals, this connects to me with what the rabbi was saying about the different types of ethics that we have, and also Catherine was saying. It's interesting that you said that deontology is a sort of central one, and that virtues and utilitarianism kind of relate to it. We don't have to choose. I think I agree with you that in many ways, utilitarianism is I think it's part of a bigger ethics. It's a very important part. But it's not a complete ethic from my point of view. I would have put virtues in the center and put deontology but I think it's interesting to have this idea that there could be different relationships between these ethics. We think we need to look at that if we're talking about a universal global ethic, which is going to guide the kind of redistribution that we need if we're going to talk about getting rid of poverty today. The last thing I would just say, if we're going to talk about goals, I think virtues is a much more effective ethic. Business people relate to virtue ethics. There's a reason why virtue ethics is now the most important ethics used in Journal of Business Ethics Quarterly, and all that kind of thing. It connects to this goals issue, I think. So it's just a few ideas. Thank you.
Yes.
Well, I'll just respond to say that I didn't mean that it's the central one. I meant simply within Jewish theology, being a revealed religion that believes in commands, then you believe that doesn't necessarily, I think Maimonides thought, for example, that while the deontology side is always there, it's really about virtue ethics down below because it was an Aristotelian, but nobody can get away within, depending on the theology, in Jewish theology, you can't get away from the deontology side, right? You can get away from the virtue ethics and be a utilitarian. And that's all I meant.
But it's a wonderful vision that the religious base puts all three together in a fundamental way. I think it's extremely important, really important.
But Katie,
Please.
Yes, hi to everyone. Really inspiring morning. I wanted to start from the point of Adam Smith made by Jeff. You know, I would say to Adam Smith that God did not provide us with invisible lens, because this would have been disqualifying and humiliating for our responsibility. He provided us with a big, wonderful orchestra room with a lot of instruments, a wonderful symphony, but the seats of the musical players are empty, and a lot of people is waiting for the show. So there is a giant misunderstanding. People should sit and play the instruments. So the real big issue in economics, poverty, and these things, that everything depends on our responsibility. So I think that the logic we should propose, which is the logic of virtue, by the way, starting from the fact that generativity is the key of human happiness, and we have a lot of data today demonstrating this, we should move to a system of four ends, not invisible ends, no? The market, active citizenship, companies, responsible companies, and enlightened institutions that trigger the energy of the society. I just conclude by saying that the 4 or 5 things where we are working actively on this today are, first of all, the revolution of generativity in finance. Generative finance, social bonds, green bonds, the true one, of course, not washing. For example, Banca Etica just issued a wonderful social bonds. Social and environmental impact metrics. Now we are at the year of the revolution of impact, okay? We are working also with the European community. Cooperation in planning and creating strategy between civil society, company and institution, co-progettazione. And finally, green and social generative procurement, border adjustment mechanism, and responsible consumption. These are the way where we should work in the future to solve the problem. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Leonardo.
So I want to ask to Jeff and to Stefano and the economists here. The great problem for me is the independency that we have in the modern world from the economy to the ethics and to the philosophy, because this is the question. In the Aristotle, ethics is economy is part of the ethic, and politics is part of the ethic. But in the modern world, the politics is independent of ethics, and also the economy is independent, not have any reference to the ethics, not virtue. Yes, it's a little thing, say, yes, but what is ethic? The self-sufficient, to have things to eat. But what is really the ethic to regard, to have some order in these things?
It is literally the case in at least at Columbia University PhD program, there isn't one day spent on ethics in a PhD. There is not even a day.
1 hour.
Not even an hour. In other words, you study a formal structure without any historical understanding, without any questions. You do learn what is known by my teacher, who was a wonderful man, very, very ethical and virtuous, but he left behind a strange argument called the Impossibility Theorem, which says, because it's not the right way to ask the question, he says you can't settle the social order. He proves that it's impossible in a diverse community to settle what is the right thing to do, because his model of what the right thing to do is a kind of voting rule, not a logic rule of human nature or other kinds of approaches that we would take. And so it's a very mechanistic idea that the challenge of the society is aggregation of diverse people, which is naturally a starting point if you take the human ambition and behaviors as given as your principal factors, which is what this kind of economics does. It says people have their wills, they have their tastes, they have their desires. Don't question them. It's not that you're going to cultivate better people. It's not that they have social responsibilities. All of that is completely ruled out from the beginning. And so if you learn anything about ethics, it is, don't bother. I was told it's so arbitrary. Now let's study the economy. Literally, I was told that. Yeah.
I wanted to invite people to talk a little bit about, given the need for redistribution to not just solve the problem of poverty now, but in perpetuity. There are a few ideas, actually practical ideas, are on the table. And as a philosopher who never has practically useful ideas, I'd love to hear them. So I'll invite some people so Jeff mentioned, and little sister Helen talked about getting money into the real economy to sustain this sort of thing. I have some ideas about what you meant. Jeff talked about, taking about 6% from the 3,000 richest people, right? And we could solve these problems right away. But I want to invite to start this conversation, actually Ingrid, to say a little bit more about, in America, we hear like $400,000 gets mentioned as a possible to talk about at what point actually you think that riches line comes, the surplus money line, where there'd be 100% marginal tax rate. Would you be willing to talk about that?
I'm happy to talk about it, but actually I think it may be a bit of a digression, because I think there are much more fundamental things. Just accepting the idea that at some point money we have is not morally ours. As long as you have no debate on those questions, you can't move to implementation about the richest line. And I want to, basically also bring together a few threads. I really think it's important in this world that's very diverse to make a distinction between the political morality and non-political morality. If you talk about taxation, you talk about political morality, except if you're going to implement a dictatorship. And all the ethical power that, for example, virtue ethics has, I do not see how you can have that in the political realm, because you will have to convince one person one by one that they should be virtuous and that they should also make them their political choices. But of course, what economics and modern philosophy, and definitely the libertarians, have done is to split what you do privately, your private decisions, and what you do politically. And of course, religions do not do this. But my fear is that the most powerful people in the world are not motivated by religious considerations. And then the question is really, what do you as this group, where I'm just a guest, want to accomplish? If you want to accomplish a change in the real world for how people talk about this, I think you should start from how these people who hold now to control and have these billions that you would like to transfer, how they reason, and start from them, and then see how you can make them change their reasoning. And I think, as I said, I think the most important question is really about do you morally owe what you have produced in the economy that is there? I think that's the most fundamental split on which people disagree.
Yes, thank you all. Since we are in this room, I'll have the room speak. So look up there above Jeff's head, and you see a lady with a yellow apron, Felicitas. Now, Aristotle says, Felicitas is not pleasure, it's not glory, it's not money, it's the exercise of virtue. Nicomachean Ethics 110. Now, I want to go back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, section 23, right to work. That was issued in December 48. The Constitution of the Italian Republic that was issued a year before, December 47, says the nation, Italy, is a country based on work. So work and virtue, that's the position.
Anybody on this on Zoom that we don't see if they want to intervene? Oh, okay. Great. Let me take Owen's thought about some practical things just briefly. First, I do think that the fact that we have the Universal Declaration and the Sustainable Development Goals are extremely important for us. They are a demonstration that in both cases, all of the United Nations member states actually signed something. And for whatever underlying reasons, it is an example of an unforced consensus. They were not asked, why exactly are you signing this? But all governments did sign this. Now, since I spend day and night trying to turn any of this into some reality, it's easy to sign things. So let's be clear that there's a huge gap between what is signed and what is real. But on the other hand, there is value in these documents. They have a life that is quite real. And I hear every day in some part of the world, both mentioned the Universal Declaration and certainly the Sustainable Development Goals. This is something to build on. This is absolutely important. We're not reinventing or not needing to invent out of nothing a global consensus. We are with the chance to help move things forward. It's important that the Universal Declaration will be having its 75th anniversary. Important for us because we can contribute directly and importantly to featuring what needs to be updated to make these goals real, to make them realized, because there's I think a prima facie argument that 75 years is enough that we did not achieve universal rights that were set in 1948. It's very interesting also, the United States, which I regard as one of the more difficult places in the world from a political, economic, and philosophical point of view, champions human rights. They don't know what it means, because in the United States, human rights are mainly what the US can use as a cudgel against other countries. It's not really the economic rights, for example. But the fact that the United States is a major proponent of the Universal Declaration, though they haven't read Articles 20 to 27, is a good thing because it means that those articles are alive. Let me mention that when it came to adopting the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in the 1960s, the United States never signed because the US does not recognize economic, social, and cultural rights. It is a libertarian elite. And that means they recognize, leave us alone. And that is, will bother you, but you leave us alone. That is unfortunately the American perspective, but the US is a signatory. I think that the Universal Declaration speaks of the progressive realization of these rights. And it speaks of international responsibilities as well as domestic responsibilities, but it makes nothing clear. It never specifies how this should be done. I've worked in the UN now 21 years. They're very good at stating goals, absolutely terrible at making plans, and even worse at getting the money to implement any plans, because it's a normative diplomatic organization. It is not a planning system, and it's not much less a financial system. But keeping the pressure that the logic of having goals is the means to implement them has importance, actually. And we can see that in many different areas of life right now, in climate change and in other areas. The pressure to move from the pronouncement to the realization is an active area where one can make a difference and have leverage. So the great gap between what we have professed and what we have is a force, potential gradient of good, if I could put it that way. It's a potential source of leverage for us moving forward. Final word, I really like in all of our discussion, whether you're utilitarian, deontological, virtue ethics, and so forth, and also the very interesting discussion we had with Kate of whether there is a difference of the bottom or whether it's a gradient all the way through. I personally strongly like the idea of minimum standards to ensure basic needs and basic dignities. Most of what I see and know is that it really makes a difference having enough to eat versus not having enough to eat, having a clinic versus not having a clinic, that there really are basics. Having them doesn't give you all of the dignity and rights that one would like. It doesn't address many inequalities, but I do regard the meeting of basic needs, nutrition, health, schooling for children, basic infrastructure as the highest priority. In utilitarian terms, it's because the marginal utility of such things is the highest by far. In human terms, virtue terms, it's because it's hard to have dignity on an empty stomach, on chronic empty stomach. And so I think that this idea of at least honoring the basics is a powerful message. And since it's so inexpensive, it is where we could get tremendous leverage. Please.
Thank you, Jeff. I admire so much what Argentina is doing now, because my friend Gustavo Vera, that is now a minister against human trafficking. And I think the influence of the Pope over his life, because they have been friends, we have to watch those good practices that are happening, because in human trafficking, you know, I've been fighting for so long, and to see what he's doing, it's an inspiration for me, but also it's a hope for my country. Gustavo is now achieving that all the victims will have a house, that they will have, you know, psychological and help for long term, and things that are so important, shelters for the victims. So, and also he's a man that has been for so long sometimes persecuted by the politicians when they were not fighting against trafficking, and now that is in office is doing a great job. Of course, thanks to Marcelo, who also support this cause. And I think those good practices should be seen as something we have to replicate because it's ethics, because he's a man of God, and because I think we all have to support those things when the door is open. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Martine.
Sorry, I'm just putting my microphone. Yes, I just wanted to react to one thing that you said, Jeff, with which I agree very much. And I think that, sometimes there is a sense that just signing those big agreements internationally are of no use because we see that it takes so long for them to actually deliver, or even, we see that they don't even deliver. But I just wanted to give you an example of why it's so important that they exist. And the fact that we've had the SDGs or the Paris Agreement, and I want to take the Paris Agreement on climate change. In France, very recently, some NGOs actually attacked in front of the tribunals, the government, for not having met its commitment to the Paris Agreement in some areas. And for the first time ever, in fact, the tribunal, the judges, judged that these NGOs were right, and the fact that France had signed the Paris Agreement, being in Paris, they of course signed it, but not implemented it in terms of reducing CO2 emissions and creating a lot of misery for some people, including in health terms, that was against the law. And that was considered, even if it's just, as you said, an international agreement that in principle is not really enshrined in the domestic law, not yet, it was considered as something very serious that the government had to act and has been actually sued and lost the case. So I think you can see more and more this sort of movements from civil society, from NGOs, taking these agreements very seriously and trying to make, of course it takes time, but implement them into national behaviors and laws and action from the government. So I think we should not dismiss those agreements. The second thing I would like to say is that I agree very much also with what Leonardo said. I think there are movements as well in terms of, you said, Jeff, that in the US, in the PhD curriculum, there's not one single hour on ethics. But if you look at what's happening in some business schools, at least in Europe, you have, it's compulsory to take an ethic course in business schools and in some economic as well, economics, university economic courses. So perhaps you have the vision in the US, but I can tell you that in Europe, you can see that this is starting to change. And the fact that business is also, some business communities are talking more and more about and developing metrics on ESG, sustainable and social, environment and sustainable and governance metrics, and the fact that this is being developed, in development, as well as measuring impacts, I wouldn't be as pessimistic. That's what I want to say. I think there is movement among the business community, among civil societies, NGOs, and so on, to push for this new agenda. And I think the young people, we should not forget what the young generations are trying to achieve as well. I don't think they're going to accept the world as it is now. They are much more conscious about both the social and environmental concerns and the way the future we're building for them.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Please, Maria Paula.
Thank you. I would like to, I have two key questions, but I would like to build on what Martin just said. effectively, some corporations are aware of their responsibility in society and their role to solve crucial societal issues and needs. And for them, profit is a mean rather than an end. But an example are the B Corp, for example, not the benefit corporations, but the B Corp. But I feel these companies are a minority, absolutely a minority. Often they are very small and entrepreneurial, and all of this is based on voluntarism. So the point is, how can we really oblige all corporations to be held accountable for their impact on society? This is the first question. The second question is about private property transmission, which concerns me personally, because I feel I live a huge conflict about the idea of passing the shares of the company I own, for example, to my children that I tried to educate to responsibility and whom I tried to pass my values, or the idea of selling the company to a multinational that could fire everybody and then give to charity the proceedings. And this is something very difficult for an entrepreneur to choose, because we still don't have ways, tools to ensure that the philosophy of a given company is perpetuated in the future, and that the buyer is not simply seeking for profit. So this is something that is very difficult to solve for an entrepreneur.
Thank you. Claude, I think you want to comment on that.
I just wanted to comment really briefly on what Maria and Martin just said with respect to the responsibility of corporations and multinationals that you mentioned in this kind of broader topic of redistribution, as so clearly and beautifully explained by Sister Helen today. I work very closely with many of these large corporations, specifically in the tech sector, some of the biggest companies, whether it's Apple, Google, Facebook. And I work with all those companies. And what I find is that by working with them, you can potentially try to become a change agent within the corporation. But the reality is they have this modus operandi of constantly talking out of both sides of their mouth, in the sense that they talk about ESG, as mentioned by Martin, but the reality is, if we really look at redistribution and what Ingrid brought up about political morality, they always find a way not to pay taxes. Whether it's Apple, whether it's Google, putting their companies in Ireland so they don't pay tax at the European level, they all do that. And so I believe that the solution is for members of civil society and perhaps even religious organizations and other entities to kind of work with these companies from the inside in order to enact some sort of systemic change, because otherwise they have no real incentive to change, given that they have lobbyists in pretty much every Congress, every parliament, and then they control the politicians. So we have to find a way to change the systemic lack of a real will for the redistribution from the inside.
Please, Katrina.
So again, getting together things, I would go back what Ingrid said, and now what we are talking about, working from different sides. And I was thinking about politicians, because I'm sure Americans are a bit better now than they were a year or two ago. But Poland, where I come from, is now in an awful situation where we are governed by politicians who are making the country down, except or apart from the fact that we, society, try to fight back. And I feel very powerless. Yes, I feel although I protest, although I got into politics myself, although I educate my students and so on, I feel that I can't do enough because it's not me who governs. Yes, it's the politician who says something, who does something. So my question is, how can we influence political side in order to have the big change? Yes, to have the real change. It's the same in America and what you said, right? I mean, if big corporations won't pay taxes, then what can you expect? Yes, how can you get out of poverty in America? And for me, I come from a socialistic country. It's nonsense. Yes, I can see how it will never work if you don't change the politics. Yes. So what to do with that?
Thank you. We'll continue reflecting on that. Sebastian.
Yes, thank you. Katrina's comment remind me something that Sonia Sachs told me in an email about something that Jeff said recently. Maybe Katrina, a mechanism, an important mechanism to think about is to stop companies paying election campaigns. That is a good mechanism. But I wanted to share with you something about what Jeff and also Rocco told about the basic needs and the connection between the SDGs and basic needs. From my reductionistic point of view as a scientist in cognitive and neurosciences, what I see, the most common thing I see is variability. So anytime we propose an RCT or an intervention for millions of people, we are masking this individuality, this individual aspect of interventions. And this means that maybe we are not thinking in an efficient way about how to spend the money we have. So we can run an RCT trying to manipulate income as an independent variable in New York, as is running now. There is a study by Noble and Duncan doing that in New York. We cannot do that in South America, for example. But even in New York, if you do that, the impact will not be the same for any family or any child. So the manipulation or there is a need to draw the different trajectories that we can expect from individuals inside a community and to connect that with the SDG and the rationale for spending the money. Okay, that's all.
Thank you. Maybe if we're about to break, let me make a response to Katrina and to this question of sometimes called the entry points or the leverage points. How does one effectuate these changes? First, I'd start by saying that Plato asked exactly the same question. So we've been at this for a long time. The whole Republic is trying to address this issue, which is how do you get to a decent society? And does it start with the ethics of the individuals or the ethics of the state, and the state creates the virtuous individuals and so on? Part of what we are seeing absolutely everywhere is that there is a reciprocal relationship between values in the society and the expressions in politics. This is not to be simplistic because there are many things to discuss. And again, Aristotle discussed many of them in the politics, but there was a basic notion that society must help to create the virtue of its citizens, or a community must create the virtues of its citizens for that governance itself to be decent. And in the United States, we are suffering from an unvirtuous public and a corrupted government. And finding which came first, well, it's bicausal. We lack the public ethics and we lack we lack civic ethics, and we lack political ethics right now. It's a very, very difficult and corrupted situation. So first, I don't think there's an easy answer to this. I think one works in all directions, and ethical training, more knowledge, better understanding of the realities, all can make government work better. Government leaders that are properly directed can help make their societies work better. Which one is going to be the provocation is varies over time, and if there is such a success. Second theme I would emphasize is we should keep in mind the children for 1,000 million reasons. One of them is their vulnerability, but there's second is what a neuroscientist would call their neuroplasticity. This is the time of formation of character, formation of physical and cognitive development, formation of being able to build being able to become a full person. And the vulnerabilities of children, therefore, are vulnerabilities of the future of their societies. On the other hand, the tremendous return you get from investing in a child lasts a lifetime. And so we really should take a generational view also. Not every adult in a society that has had terrible luck is going to have the kind of life that they should have deserved. But the children can be helped tremendously. And we're not geared towards that sufficiently in orientation. I can tell you, in 20 years, I've never seen an interest in helping put kids to school in the global scene. It's the weirdest thing I've experienced. I've raised a lot of money for health, maybe because disease somehow makes people feel more uncomfortable or more vulnerable. But if you try to appeal for funding for children in school, nothing has happened for 20 years. This is the strangest point imaginable, because there is no society in the world that doesn't depend more on what it does for its kids than on any other single thing that it does in the world, period. And so I raise this as a massive point of leverage. It's hard to change adult minds anyway. It's hard to train, though we should try. But it is much easier to train a child whose brain is developing, who is opening to the world. And our core should be that no child is suffering from such poverty that they are left in ill health, stunted, unable to find a place in classroom, being pushed out of school in 5 years, barely able to read and no support, and then wondering what's going wrong with the society. So I think that this is a second massive leverage point. And it also fits that young people have more agency. They have much less power, but they want to change the world. And so it's something to tap into. That's why I think the Pope is so brilliant to have launched the economy of Francesco for young people. He didn't say, let's get all the old economists together to discuss this.
Also, the speech of this morning, speak about this.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. This I think is a huge, huge reality that we have not sufficiently tapped into. But Pope Francis, as usual, got it exactly right.
Can I say one thing, Jeff, that there are some limitations, of course, to raising kids or giving kids opportunities without giving their parents some opportunity also.
I know.
I mean, kids are not living in a vacuum, just a psychologist remark.
No, of course, it's true. But if we focus on what to do to ensure the child can have a decent future, we'll have a good focus.
But I think that's a good focus, and I think that includes doing something for their families.
I
as
agree.
well. Yeah.
For the family. Yes, I think it's very important.
Can I push back on that?
Yes.
Just because I spent a lot of time in Brazil, and the Bolsa Familia, the one condition was that kids had to be in school. But a lot of, in states like Paraná, Bahia State, and so on, the parents took the money and never sent these kids to school. So, it's a lot more complex, I feel, than.
Well, it is, no, it is complex. And I just think that you cannot think about children's development without also including the direct
I think it's
context.
very important.
I agree.
Also to put this in the goals, insist it, because it's clear that also the idea of the human rights is too much individualistic approach,
Mhm.
not consider the family, not
Mhm.
consider that is also a subject really in the society.
It's a
This
wonderful
is
point.
very
There's
important.
nothing in the SDGs about
Exactly.
family.
Yeah, this is very
Nothing.
important. Nothing. Yeah, we need to add this.
Yeah.
So fraternity, the idea of this,
But the FAO has launched a decade of family farm.
exactly.
It's not just.
Something is moving ahead. Yeah, maybe. Okay.
We break for lunch.